afternoon, everyone. I am David Hannay. I was permanent representative to the UN rather a long time ago, between 1990 and 1995. But I do keep in touch with UN things through having been chair of the UN Association, many of whose members I'm glad to see here today, for 5 or 6 years, and then I chair the all-party parliamentary group on the UN, which meets pretty regularly, most recently to hear the new special advisor on the responsibility to protect last week, Jennifer Welsh. And I'm here really just to provide the feeds to Mark Lyle-Grant, who I'm sure is known to most in this room as the current ambassador to the UN, who is here. And if I could just start with a couple of logistical things, which I've been told I mustn't forget. The event is being jointly hosted by the United Nations Association and Chatham House, and also with the participation of at least one member of the UN all-party group, I myself. It is being held on the record. It is being live streamed on Chatham House website. People can comment via Twitter using hashtag #CHEvents and ask questions via hashtag AskCH, sorry. I hope you could have already switched off all your mobile phones. That would be kind if you would do that. And I should just mention that the UNA UK is having its big annual forum, full day of discussion about UN topics on the 28th of June. And hopefully some people in this room will decide afterwards that they're so interested by what Mark has said that they would like to sign up and hear more at the end of June. Well, so much for the logistics. It's a testing time, of course, for the UN. I say that because it's one of those more downs than ups moment in the roller coaster, which the UN always seems to ride on. And it's even more important then to hear from someone like Mark, who's there at the coalface, what it seems to be like now, how bad the situation is, what can be done, what can't be done. I mean, when I say that it's a testing time, it's because there are, for an outsider like myself, some of the symptoms of Cold War paralysis that we had affecting at least 2 parts of the world, 3 really, Syria, anywhere in the borders of Russia, and anywhere between China and its neighbors in the East China and South China Seas. And for all those 3 areas, it's quite difficult to see how the UN Security Council can operate, and indeed it has been prevented from operating by vetoes on at least 2 of them, and would be on the 3rd, the South China Sea, if anybody ever had the temerity to take it to the Security Council. So perhaps, Mark, I could start by just asking you to talk a bit about this, I don't want to call it, it's not a full Cold War situation, because during the Cold War, of course, there was blanket paralysis, and people lined up on one or other side, and it was really almost impossible for the UN to do anything about even regional disputes, which were nothing much to do with the main players. It's not like that, but could you perhaps say something about what it is like in that respect? That's to say, the paralyzed subjects and the ones, and then perhaps we could go on after that for a minute to look at the non-paralyzed ones, and are they likely to stay unparalyzed?
Yes, thank you very much, David, and it's a pleasure to be here today. I think that is the main difference between now and the Cold War. Yes, we have a complete blockage on Syria and have had more or less complete blockage for 3 years now. There have been the odd shaft of light. We did get the resolution on chemical weapons, and it's a broadly positive story, although not completely positive. And we got the humanitarian resolution through also in January. Now that has allowed us at least to continue to discuss Syrian issues and make some common cause with the Russians and Chinese on those issues. On Ukraine, there is, of course, a complete paralysis. We tried to put a resolution forward that we thought would get widespread acceptance. We were not surprised by the Russian veto, but we feel we pitched it about right. The fact that China abstained was a good sign that we did get that one about right. But the big difference is that on other business, and we shouldn't forget that Africa still makes up, as it probably did in your day, David, about 60% of Security Council business. And on that, Russia has actually been at pains to show that it's still prepared to be cooperative. So whether we're looking at Somalia or South Sudan or Mali or Central African Republic, those sorts of issues, there is broadly business as usual, you might say, in the Security Council. Secondly, we shouldn't completely lose sight of the non-Security Council business, where the dynamic is extremely different. I mean, arguably the most important agenda that faces the UN at the moment is the post-2015 development agenda. Now there, the split up is completely different. You have, in a sense, the Latin Americans, Indians on one side, partly supported by the Russians, who want to focus on Western development aid and on environmental issues. You have the Africans, the Europeans, trying to focus on eradication of absolute poverty. So that's just one example. Climate change, the dynamics are very, very different. Non-proliferation, where actually the P5 are sort of aligned against many others. So it's not paralyzed in the way that it was completely in the Cold War, but there's no doubt that the atmosphere has got more bitter on these blocked issues. And we've had a number of meetings of the Security Council, we had 15 meetings of the Security Council on Ukraine, and some of the language is fairly undiplomatic, even in the public sessions, let alone in the private sessions. And it's very similar to that on Syria.
Yeah, and do you think that that distinction between the paralyzed part of the Security Council and the unparalyzed part can be sustained? Is that sustainable if the confrontations over the South and East China Seas, the Ukraine, Syria, which very well could get sharper? Do you think that can be maintained? Do you think, for example, that the Iran nuclear issue, which one day or another is quite likely to come back to the Security Council in one form or another, whether because there will have been an agreement and there will be a phased lifting of sanctions, or whether because there's a failure to agree and there will be a major threat to international peace and security, do you think that that can be sustained in that sort of half paralyzed, half not paralyzed world, or is it likely to spread?
I think it can be sustained, subject to one criteria. If Russian forces went across the border into eastern and southern Ukraine, then we are in a Cold War situation. Then I think we would see a reversion to what we had during the Cold War. That would completely change the norm. That would be such an attack on the sort of international order, going well beyond what's happened in Crimea, that I think it would be virtually impossible to do business as usual on African conflict issues and other issues that the Security Council deals with.
Right. Well, so we'll have to watch that space. Now, perhaps you could just say a little bit about the responsibility to protect, which seems rather, to my mind, like the concept that dare not speak its name. That's to say that the UN is actually doing several operations which, under any conceivable analysis, are the responsibility to protect, like South Sudan or Mali or the Central African Republic, or possibly you could say even Somalia. But as far as I can see, nobody ever wants to call it that, because that blows several fuses and starts every nerves jangling and so on. But could you say something, particularly as we now have a new special advisor who was in London talking to a UNA conference last week, Jennifer Welsh, who I found most impressive. Could you say a bit about how you think R2P can be taken ahead?
I don't think it's quite as bad as that, David. If you start having a theoretical discussion about responsibility to protect in a seminar format or this sort of format, then very quickly you get the views are polarized. But as you say, in practice, in the Security Council mandates that we're adopting every week, we are not only employing the concept of responsibility to protect civilians, but also we're actually putting in the words responsibility to protect, which have now appeared in something like 15 different resolutions since 2005. So it is being used in the context that preventing genocide, protecting civilians in African conflicts in particular. But it is true that at the academic level, there has been a bit of a pushback against it, because there are many people who fear that we are using the concept of responsibility to protect to justify intervention, a cutting across sovereignty and territorial integrity. But in practice, it's there. There is an advisor on responsibility to protect. There's a group of friends, of which the United Kingdom is one, of a cross-cutting. It's actually co-chaired by Rwanda and Netherlands are the two co-chairs of the responsibility to protect group of friends, which meets and does talk about those sort of cross-cutting theoretical issues. But basically, protection of civilians has become the centerpiece of almost all UN peacekeeping missions in a way it wasn't 15, 20 years ago. So all the instances you've mentioned, but also many others, we are focusing peacekeeping on protecting civilians in situations where either their government is unable to protect them or unwilling to protect them, or is indeed part of the problem in the first place.
Yeah, and am I right in thinking that the great white whale of UN diplomacy, the enlargement of the Security Council, is not only unharpooned, but is out there swimming in the great ocean and not likely to be harpooned in the foreseeable future?
Well, it's been swimming for about 15 years now. I think there's a certain amount of thrashing around, and certainly the sort of the boats, the harpoon boats, are circling. But I'm not optimistic that it will be nailed in the near future. No, the trouble is that there is an overwhelming support at the United Nations for reform of the Security Council. But everyone has a slightly different vision and a vested interest in how that reform should happen and in what shape. And those opposing forces are blocking the chances of any breakthrough in it. As I say, that the intensity of the discussions is increasing, but my personal view is that until the African bloc changes its position on Security Council reform, it's unlikely to make any dramatic progress.
And presumably neither the Chinese nor the Americans are actually going to lose any sleep over the fact that it's swimming around there, because they are both of them likely to be naysayers if it ever became a practicality.
Yes. China in particular is virulently opposed to Japan and indeed India joining the Security Council, and they're probably of the permanent members the least enthusiastic about Security Council reform. The Russians are much more positive. The Americans are not against it, but just don't see it as a priority. They see the debate being blocked, and in the Washington policy formulation, one doesn't really get serious interagency discussion until an issue becomes real, and they don't feel it's real yet, so it's just not a top priority for them.
And just picking up on, sorry, I forgot to mention on responsibility to protect, just picking up on this French initiative, which is the suggestion that there should be a kind of gentleman's agreement amongst the 5 permanent members that if a genocide was either taking place or threatened to take place, there would be no question of using the veto. An idea which was in fact in the high-level panel report of 2004. How is that faring, and are we going to throw our weight behind it, as I hope we will?
There's a lot of support for it at the UN. We're certainly interested by that idea, but we would like to make sure that it is at least a P3 idea, that if the United States, France, and the UK were together deciding to pursue it, then there could be some potential value in it. I don't think there's really any value in it doing it at a UK-France level. Of course, best of all would be if there was agreement among the P5, but we're a very long way from that, and the informal discussions we've had suggest that that's not likely to change in the near future.
Right. Well, could you give us perhaps a preview, which I'm sure everyone here would find fascinating, to the 2016 election of a new Secretary General?
Well, there's a number of interesting elements about the election of the Secretary General. One is that there is a view that it is Eastern Europe's turn. They have not had a UN Secretary General from the Eastern European region. They feel that it is their turn. However, there is no formal rotation, as there is in some other elections at the UN, and therefore there is nothing to stop candidates from other parts of the world also chucking their hat into the ring. Second point I would make is that there has been a significant grade inflation in international jobs. Many Under-Secretaries General at the United Nations are ex-heads of state and government. And therefore, it's quite likely that a Secretary General next time round will come from that category of politician. The third point I would make is that there is a sort of a view, an undercurrent anyway, that maybe it's time for a female Secretary General of the United Nations. Now, you put all that together against the cross-section of about 10 Eastern European candidates that have already chucked their names into the ring, either formally or informally, and there are still some names that meet all three categories. And it'll be interesting to see who emerges. It's a waiting game, as you'll remember, David. It's not always the leader. In fact, it's very rarely the front runner that gets through. There is a predisposition to, I wouldn't say lowest common denominator, but finding a compromise candidate who is acceptable to everybody, because there are certain members, including certain P5 members, not the United Kingdom, who have a slightly different vision of the Secretary General as being someone who, to put it very crudely, is the servant of the member states rather than the leader of the organization. Or as Ban Ki-moon sometimes says, more secretary than general. Our view is that we would want the best possible Secretary General with the best possible qualifications and leadership skills, because we believe in the multilateral system, we believe in the UN, we want it to be a strong institution. But that view is not universally shared, it has to be said. The other dynamic I would mention, which is going to be interesting about this election, is that traditionally the selection and election of the Secretary General of the UN is a sort of P5 prerogative and closely preserved prerogative. That, I think, is beginning to break down, and there'll be much greater pressure from the General Assembly to have a say in the candidates. Now, whether that will mean simply candidates, once they're sort of formally announced and out there, and let's not forget that it'll be summer 2016 when the decision is taken, so it's still 2 years away, they will be encouraged to come to the General Assembly, set out their stall, set out their manifestos, if you like. That, I think, would be sort of normal and not controversial. What would become slightly more controversial is if the General Assembly wanted to go one step further, and on the back of those hustings, those hearings, were to decide to make a recommendation to the Security Council on who they thought would be the best candidate. My guess is there'll be so many divisions it won't be possible to do that. But then I think the Security Council and the P5 members might push back against that as going against the articles of the Charter.
On the East Europeans, the East European group is now just a fiction, really. It exists for electoral purposes, but not in any meaningful other way. Of course, it was created in completely different circumstances. But ironically, I imagine that anybody who we thought was in good standing an East European would likely to attract a Russian veto now, which is not a very happy situation. Is there any way in which in 2016 we can at least get away from regional preemption in the first round of people putting their names forward? That's to say, encourage a global slate of people knowing that an element of rotation will undoubtedly enter into the final choice. And that might be some way of finessing the East Europeans' attempt to run such a preemptive operation.
Yes, I mean, we haven't taken a formal position on that and are unlikely to do so until after the next election in the UK, because obviously this is a decision in which our ministers and our Prime Minister will take a very close interest. We formally do not accept the idea of rotation, but equally we're not formally contesting it at this stage. There are, as I mentioned, a couple of candidates who are hovering around from outside the region who certainly might come into play. And I think if that starts to happen, you could get a snowball effect and many other people will come in. But of course, there are some regions who are next in line who have an interest in having their turn coming down the pike. So they may be a little bit more resistant to breaking the rotation.
Yes, and the idea you were suggesting about hustings or manifestos does seem to me to be a thoroughly good one, and one which should be encouraged. Is that not how it looks to you?
I think so.
Because, I mean, if nothing else, among other things, it would mean that whoever is finally chosen has got a little bit of a mandate, because he would have said what he was going to try and do in broad terms. And so something that's always been lacking hitherto, where Secretary-General candidates have tended to tell the 5 permanent members exactly what each of them wants to hear, which of course was never identically the same, that would, to some extent, be short-circuited.
Yes, I think in principle it's a good idea. And indeed, it's only really an extension of what happens now, because Ban Ki-moon will tell you that, you know, when he was a candidate, he went to the African Union Summit, he went to the ASEAN Summit, he went to the East Asian meetings. So he sort of went and presented himself, but in each regional sort of grouping rather than coming to the UN. And I think it's only a logical extension of that there would be some, it would have to be informal obviously, but some sort of informal event which all member states could be represented to have a chance to have a look at the candidate, ask questions, sort of get a cut of their jib, as it were.
Yes. Well, I mean, the Ban case was, alas, I suspect, the locus classicus for having a rather weak field by accepting regional preemption before you started. Because apart from Ban, the field was very weak indeed.
Yes, I wasn't involved at that stage, but I think there were quite a number of candidates. I can't speak for
Yeah, they weren't, I think, all that outstanding, frankly. Anyway, perhaps we could just finish before we throw the floor open to questions, which we'll do at past. Perhaps you could just say a little bit about Britain's position at the UN. Of course, we have virtually no peacekeepers deployed because of our preoccupation with Afghanistan and before that with Iraq. Is that going to change? Are we going to play a more prominent role in UN peacekeeping than the past? What would be the effect at the UN of a yes vote in Scotland? Well, that's probably enough to be going on.
Well, what I would say is the United Kingdom standing at the UN is very high. Obviously, we have a privileged position as a permanent member of the Security Council. But the fact that we are the only G20 country, and I say G20, not just G7 or G8, as was, to meet the 0.7% development target for overseas aid gives us a huge credibility and platform from which to use our influence in the General Assembly, you know, well beyond the Security Council. And of course, the English language is a massive benefit in terms of negotiating in every fora at the UN. So those sort of 3 legs of the stool, as I see it, are very much there. On the peacekeeping side, yes, we are looking at, and I'm in close contact with Ministry of Defence and the Foreign Office ministers on this, that as we draw down from Afghanistan, there is the opportunity to re-engage in slightly bigger numbers in UN peacekeeping, because we have a very strong interest in UN peacekeeping. We pay a premium as a P5 member to the budget of the peacekeeping. The budget is going up as we've mandated new peacekeeping operations in Mali and more recently in Central African Republic. We've upped it in South Sudan, etc. So we have a very strong interest in making that work. And therefore, the Ministry of Defense is looking at the possibility over the next few years in contributing a little bit more, particularly in some of the niche capabilities, you know, the helicopters, UAVs, intelligence, strategic airlift, and those sorts of things in which the traditional troop contributors maybe don't have the same capacity to meet the changing need of conflict. Scotland, well, we're not making any contingency plans on Scotland. The government is confident but not complacent that that will be won, that the referendum will not vote for Scottish independence. If it does, obviously we'll deal with that at the time. But, I mean, there are precedents that one can draw around the world if that happened.
Yes, and the most recent precedent, which was, of course, the Soviet Union metamorphosing into the Russian Federation, occurred in 24 hours overnight. So you might have to move quite fast if that happened. Just one final word before throwing the word. You spoke a little about the MDGs. The Paris 2015 Climate Change Conference, how is the UN going to avoid the really rather appalling precedent of Copenhagen, which should, I would have hoped, reminded people that getting 192 people around a table, or what, a lot of tables probably, in a capital and expecting them to solve problems that they haven't pre-solved before is not to be encouraged. Is there any thought going into all this? Because this really is, it's not quite perhaps going to be the last chance because the climate's still going to be with us whatever happens, but it is a pretty important moment.
No, Ban Ki-moon is very aware of that. This is one of his priorities for the remainder of his term, and he has called a summit in September this year, to which he's invited all the leaders to try and plan the Paris meeting in 2015. And he has encouraged, he's written to all leaders already, and encouraged them to come to New York with some very ambitious proposals of what they're prepared to do, and to see whether that generates a sufficient ambition and sufficient commonality that one might be able to reach agreement. But there are some quite interesting things happening on climate. China's position has changed in quite a significant way, is one interesting development that could change the dynamics of the negotiation for next year. So it's not a hopeless case. I certainly agree with you that it needs a lot of preparation. Happily, most of that negotiation and preparation doesn't happen in New York. It happens at the UNFCCC outside New York. That's based in Bonn. So we don't get involved in the nitty-gritty sort of negotiations. But I do chair a friends group on climate change of about 30 ambassadors in New York to try and galvanize them, to galvanize their own governments to try and be as ambitious as possible and try and reach a legally binding agreement, which is obviously the eventual aim.
Right. Well, now we have a time for questions, and perhaps anybody asking questions could say their name, and if they do represent an organization, could say the organization. Yes. There, please.
Problems have been mounting up. We are unable to solve the problems, mainly because of short-termism of geopolitics. Governments and intergovernmental organizations, including the UN, have not been able to solve problems. Our British visionary, Dr. James Martin, has been seriously thinking about it. Yes.
Could we possibly have a question?
Yes,
and
that's a question.
And
right.
Your name.
Okay, Mrs. Selvaratnam, for Women for Justice and Peace in Sri Lanka. So, there are suggestions by this eminent person who unfortunately passed away last year. He established 21st century school at Oxford University and created a commission called Commission for Future Generations, from experts from all around the world. There are recommendations. I appeal to
could we
all
have
the
the
governments.
could we
I
have a
appeal to
question,
all the
please?
governments to look at it seriously because they are all unable to solve problems. Thank you.
Okay. Over here, yes, please. We'll take three at a time.
I'll just follow that question. My name is Jamil Gursa. I'm a member of Chatham House. Since the inception of United Nations, including the Security Council, it seems to me no problems have ever been solved because of the division amongst themselves, the members. Isn't it the time now to reform the United Nations, including the Security Council, and put the votes to majority and abolish the right of vetoes? Thank you.
And there was somebody over, sorry, yes, here, please, in the front row.
I'm Noel Staples. I'm a Quaker, so I'm going to be sort of a voice crying in the wilderness. I was wondering if there was ever any chance of the veto, which seems to be the biggest stumbling block to any kind of agreement over really serious matters, being abandoned. I mean, the Quaker method of business is quite different. It's sometimes described as beyond consensus. But if that could be introduced on a broader scale across the world, I think it would be very good. But is there any possibility of the veto ever being dropped?
Right, Mark, there's three first, and then we'll take another round.
I haven't heard of this publication, but if you want to give it to me afterwards, I'll have a look at it. On the UN reform and the veto, which goes to both the other two questions, I think one has to recall the origin of the veto. And the origin of the veto is in the failure of the League of Nations. The League of Nations was set up after the First World War. Everyone said never again. We set up some international governance organization of the League of Nations. The reason that the League of Nations failed and failed to stop the Second World War was because not all the big powers at the time bought into it. So the lesson was learned, and in 1945, when the United Nations was set up, the way to bind in the big powers was to give them the veto. And therefore, the veto is the guarantee that the United States and the Soviet Union at the time, the UK, France, and then later China, were buying into the international order. If you take that away, the risk is, and it's a risk in Washington as much as in Moscow probably, that you will lose the buy-in to the international organization by some of the big powers around the world. And that is the risk. Now, the question is it worth taking that risk, getting rid of the veto? And that is a challenge. And certainly most people would argue that it's more important to make the Security Council representative by widening it and bringing in some of the new emerging powers, the Brazils, the Indias, the Japans, the Germans, etc., rather than trying to take away the veto.
And the question here?
I think that was the question, wasn't it?
Oh, that was the veto too, was it?
But that comes to the same thing. I mean, the Security Council is one of the few UN organs that does vote by majority, but subject, obviously, to the veto. Now, you only need 9 out of the 15 members to vote in favor, provided you don't have a veto. In the General Assembly, it's a simple one person, one vote. Most of the other organs work by consensus. Actually, not the Human Rights Council also works on a majority system. So it is a mixture. You can argue that you could change that. You could argue that the UN should have a greater legal personality, but let's not forget that the UN is an organization of member states. It's not like the European Union. It doesn't have a commission in the same way that has its own powers. The Secretariat is entirely dependent on the member states. So in that sense, it's an organization that the individual member states do attach a lot of importance to. And we found this out after the passage of the Lisbon Treaty. And the European Union, as the European Union members, we wanted to give the European Union as an organization greater rights of speaking in the General Assembly. There was a huge pushback against that by the 104 small states of the United Nations, because they saw any enhancement of an individual region's rights in the General Assembly as undermining the fundamental intergovernmental nature of the General Assembly, whereby China, population 1.4 billion, has the same vote as Tuvalu, population 11,000. So it was the small states that pushed back against that. So, and I think one has to respect that. You know, the United Nations is an organization of individual member states.
Yes, but no, sorry, hang on. Yes, but just wait for the microphone, could you?
How can a ceasefire be held in Syria?
And yes, in the middle here, please. Right in the middle at the front.
John Wilson, I'm a member of the Institute and the journalist. My question is this: will the United Kingdom have its Security Council seat in 10 years' time? And if your answer is yes, would that be influenced if we were to lose Trident?
And yes, back there, please. Yeah.
Thank you for giving me time. My name is Sokalingam Yogalingam. I'm an MP of Transnational Government and European candidate for European Parliament election as well. I am a proud member of British Tamil, and I was a Sri Lankan Tamil as well. The question is, as Sri Lankan government, you know, May 2009, there was a genocide of Tamils took place, and UN even states that over 40 to 60,000 people been killed, innocent people been killed. And there is a Sri Lankan government made a presidency to kill the innocent people in the country as they like. That's been repeated in many other countries. Now, the same time, now lately, they have, as a democratic people, foreign country people, they've been made into a list of terrorists. If you are acting and voicing for rights of the humans, they've been treated as terrorists. And that's going to be repeated in all over the world as well by the presidents. It's just they are making a presidency for the other countries, whereas UN are coming to play that. My question is, UN must make a play, and human rights, head of human rights, Namadina Pillai said, it is American passed a resolution to have this, it will go against the human rights. And that is being used by the Sri Lankan government. And I hope UN will change that and pass a different resolution to stop that, because that will use against all the people around the world to destroy the human rights. Thank you.
Those three.
The ceasefire in Syria, we're a long way from that, frankly, at the moment. Everyone agrees, including the Russians and the Chinese, that there is no military solution, that there has to be a political solution. But as you know, Lakhdar Brahimi announced his resignation from the position of Special Envoy on Syria. No successor has yet been appointed, although there will be someone appointed for next month. But he tried, Kofi Annan before him tried very hard, drew up some principles. We had a Geneva communique agreed by all the P5 members and the regional players back in June 2012. But unfortunately, it's proved impossible to implement it, mainly because Assad and his regime are determined to crush the opposition by any means possible. And they believe that there is a military solution. So the only ceasefires that they have accepted are those of the starve or surrender type that we've seen recently in Homs, where they besieged the city, they didn't allow humanitarian aid in, and they essentially forced a ceasefire for the few remaining civilians and fighters in the city to escape the city, and then they've now taken over Homs, and they're trying that tactic again in other places. Now, that is not acceptable to us. We have passed a resolution demanding humanitarian access to all those in need in Syria, including in the hard-to-reach areas, which are the areas besieged by government forces, and we're looking at presenting another resolution in the next 10 days precisely to enforce that resolution that has not been complied with by the regime in particular. So that's certainly one strand. Secondly, you'll have seen that we're likely to vote in the next few days on a resolution of referring the situation in Syria to the International Criminal Court because of the human rights abuses that are being committed primarily by the regime, but also by some of the more extreme parts of the armed opposition. And that that resolution may well be vetoed by Russia. They're certainly threatening to veto it. But I think the vast mass of members of the United Nations believe that that's what we should do. Indeed, many would argue we should have done it some time ago. Well, all these things are possible, but they require the political will on both sides, and we have seen absolutely no political will at all on the part of the Assad regime. In the talks that took place in Geneva, there were 2 weeks of talks essentially in January and February in Geneva. Lakhdar Brahimi has said publicly in the General Assembly that the regime negotiators did not come with any intention to negotiate. The opposition did, and that's why they were unsuccessful, and he's decided to throw in the towel. John, your point on the UK seat, yes, I think the United Kingdom will have a seat in 10 years' time, and I think would fully deserve to have a seat. I mean, we are still one of the top, 6 contributors, 5 contributors to the UN, top 6 economies in the world, and, we have as I say, we're the only G20 country to meet the 0.7% target, and we're likely to remain the only one for a very long time because no one else is even close, and many are not even trying to reach that target. So we have a huge number of assets that we bring to the UN, as well as our history and our democracy, etc. So I don't think anyone is contesting the right to the United Kingdom to have a permanent seat. It's just that others would like to also have permanent seats. On Sri Lanka, there have been 2 important developments. One is that the United Nations recognized that errors were made by the UN system at the time of the end of the fighting in 2009. And that has led directly to a new concept called Rights Up Front, which is led by the Secretary General and the Deputy Secretary General, and has instituted sort of new methods of working across the different parts of the UN system to ensure that in the name of humanitarian access, you do not compromise on human rights. That was the particular issue at the time in Sri Lanka, that in order to get the humanitarian access, and the government controlled the humanitarian access, some compromises were made on human rights. And a very strong report was written by a member of the UN, who's actually a British national, Charles Petrie, which has changed the way of working in the UN on that. The second development is that the Human Rights Council in Geneva has adopted a resolution instituting an international investigation into human rights abuses in Sri Lanka. That was heavily contested, not only by the Sri Lankan government, but by many others, Russia, China, Cuba, obviously, Venezuela, obviously, but indeed some countries that should have known better. But nonetheless, it was adopted, and there will now be an international investigation into the human rights abuses in Sri Lanka.
Cyprus High Commissioner.
Thank you. UN has very often been described as an iceberg. We tend to see the political stuff forgetting underneath what is happening. First, frightfully important to make tribute to that and the wonderful work that is being done. UN is as powerful as its member states make it to be. I think that's also worth underlining, so there are some inherent faults. Since we all have, as a global village, an international interest to make it more effective, what would be the 3 things, if you had the magic wand, what would be the 3 things that you would recommend that we do in order to make it more effective? Perhaps a legal personality, the likes of the Commission, if that can ever be possible, or whatever comes to your mind. I'm sure you must have reflected on it. Thank you.
Yes, in the middle there, please. Sorry. Yes, yes, please.
Thank you. Margaret Anstey, former Under-Secretary General. So, Mark, you said that we all want to have a very strong Secretary General, which is very encouraging because some cynics, I'm not among them, but think that the great powers always want to have somebody who's more malleable, shall we say. I'm going to ask a question which may seem a little naive and to which I suspect I know the answer, but I'm wondering if there's any chance of having some kind of procedure which would ensure that those candidates who are eventually considered do have at least the basic qualifications. And here I'm referring to because this would avoid what has so often happened, that in the end we have the least common denominator. Of course, the decision will always be political, but at least it would solve that situation or make it improve the situation if the people who were considered for that political decision were each valid candidates. I'm referring here to the proposal that was made quite some years ago by Brian Urquhart and Erskine Childers, to that effect, that there should be some kind of machinery, representative machinery, which would ensure that. The corollary of that, and it was to apply not only to the Secretary General but to all the Directors General of specialised agencies, the corollary was that there should only be one term, perhaps a longer term, so that you go down to history by what you've done and not by how many times you've been re-elected and thus prone to political pressures.
Yeah, over here on the right, please.
Neville Grant, United Nations Association. My question is about Israel-Palestine. Given the number of UN resolutions Israel has ignored or broken, and international laws broken, what could possibly be the way forward? Do you think that BDS might or should play a role in a solution? Boycott, disinvestment, and sanctions.
Yeah. Okay, well, thanks very much. Yes, High Commissioner, three things. Well, let me give you three things. I mean, one is, I think, going back to slightly what we were saying before about empowerment of the Secretary General. I think, you know, member states have got to be prepared to empower the Secretary General. Allow him, not try and control him too much. Yes, they should endorse his manifesto. Yes, they should give him an envelope of money. But they should allow him to move resources around within that envelope without trying to micromanage the process. And the reality is that the Fifth Committee, which some of you will know, which deals with administrative and budgetary matters at the UN, has become highly politicized and micromanages to the nth degree the amount of money. So you cannot move a secretary from one section to another section without getting endorsement of the Fifth Committee now. And that sort of siloization of resources makes no sense at all in a crisis-ridden era when you've got to be able to move and respond quickly. Secondly, to pick up your point, I think absolutely the one term, I think, is a very good idea. You could lengthen the term, if you wanted, from 5 years to 7 years, say, but make it a one-term Secretary General so he doesn't feel that he has to look over his shoulder at re-election. And he's not therefore afraid of upsetting some of the big powers because he'll get blocked. And it has happened in the past, as we know, that a second term has been vetoed. So I think that would be a second. The third thing is to try and move away from the sort of block-to-block mentality at the UN. And it's got worse, frankly, in the 4 years I've been at the UN. It's always been there, of course, but it's got worse. You've got a greater politicization of even technical committees like the ACABQ. You have a situation where almost all negotiations come down to negotiations between the African Union or the G77 and the European Union plus like-minded. And individual countries are disempowered in that, and they feel themselves bound by the sort of group mentality and the group discipline in a rather unhealthy way. And, you know, maybe that's necessary in Parliament, but I don't think it's good for the United Nations. You get much better discussion, quality of exchange in the sort of friends groups that I've mentioned, which are by definition sort of cross-cutting groups where you can really talk substance. Most of the negotiations at the UN are sort of sloganizing on one side and the other. And I think if one could get away from that, I think that'd be very valuable. Qualities of the Secretary General, yes. I think it would be quite difficult to do that. I think given that almost all Secretary General candidates will either have been a head of government or foreign minister, they would consider themselves to be well qualified by definition. What I think has improved a lot, and I've seen it even in my time at the UN, is the rigor and competition for appointments at Under-Secretary General level and Assistant Secretary General. I don't know what it was like in your appointment, but now it is actually quite rigorous. There are proper job descriptions. You have to put in a bid and a manifesto, your CVs, etc. They're sifted in a professional way. There's an interview panel that takes time, interviews all the people in some detail, and then 3 names at least, including 1 woman, has to go to the Secretary General, and he chooses the candidates. Now, at that last stage, inevitably, because this is the United Nations, and it's important, some geographical representation, gender balance comes into play. And the Secretary General, I think, has done a fantastic job in gender balance in particular. 40% of the USGs and ASGs are female now, which I think is a good thing. But he's only been able to do that because he's insisted that the final selection comes from a group that includes a woman. And he does come under huge pressure. Everyone's lobbying like crazy for their own nationals, and he has to make sure that there is a broad, cross-cutting representation from all member states. Otherwise, you will lose the member state buy-in to that. So, but overall, within those political constraints that are always going to be there, it's become a much more rigorous and competence-based, if you like, appointment process, and that, I think, is good. The Secretary General, as I say, that's a different thing at the moment. On Israel-Palestine, look, this is one of those 50-year conflicts. It's not the only one, but it's certainly one of those 50-year conflicts. And the UN has had very little traction on it. It's mitigating the sort of worst excesses through, obviously, support for refugees and supporting the process, etc., humanitarian support. But essentially, it is down to the 2 parties and, obviously, with the facilitation of the United States. Now, the current effort has run into the sand for the time being and has been suspended. There's a lot of talk of Europe filling the space. I'm not sure how realistic that is in practice. It cannot be done without the United States that has a unique relationship with one of the parties. And so it's difficult to see what the UN can do in its own right to sort of drive that process forward, to be honest. President Abbas was in London yesterday, and what President Abbas has said and what he would like is recognition. Not so much BDS, but go straight to sort of recognition of Palestine. 104 countries of the United Nations, I think it is, have recognized the independent state of Palestine. He believes that if everyone recognized, then the dynamic would change. Our view is that there needs to be a negotiated settlement, that it isn't about resolutions, you've got to have an agreement between the 2 parties. And at the moment, neither side appears to be willing to make the necessary political decisions and compromises in order to reach that agreement. But we will not give up because, although, as I say, the United States' role is critical, this is a conflict that's on our doorstep, not on the American doorstep.
We've just got time for one more question. I'm sorry. Only one more, not one more round, one more over there.
My name is Noriki Shikata from Embassy of Japan. You have referred to the issue of UN Security Council reform and the difficulties that we are facing. At the same time, there is, as you referred to, majority of UN members supporting the reform. And in terms of principles of more better representation or legitimacy, efficiency, and effectiveness, there could be a good support for council reform. From your viewpoint, how could we overcome these realistic challenges or obstacles? And is there any sense of urgency in terms of possible loss of relevance of UN Security Council in tackling major international security challenges that we are facing today?
Yes, I don't think there's any loss of relevance. I mean, what's striking about the Security Council is that there is you can say it's not representative, but no one is suggesting it's not legitimate. Legitimacy actually comes more from effectiveness than representation. And what risks the credibility, if you like, I wouldn't say relevance, but the credibility of the Security Council is the fact that it isn't at the moment able to tackle these big crises in Ukraine and Syria, not the makeup of the Security Council. No one, even the countries that flout Security Council resolutions, don't pretend that those resolutions are not binding and do not have an impact and an effect. So it's not so much the legitimacy, it's the representativity. Japan, of course, is a member of the G4 countries, Japan, Germany, Brazil, India, who are at the forefront of pushing forward the reform process. And I think really the tactics of how to move forward depends on the G4. You know, we have said we support the G4 plus African representation, and we will support their efforts in taking it forward and trying to break through this logjam. Obviously, we give advice informally, but we're fully supportive of the G4 aspirations. They, I think, need to decide what is the best way to go forward. My own personal view, which I mentioned already, is that they have to break out of the African so-called Esselwini consensus. The Africans have to decide who are their candidates, their two candidates for permanent membership. As long as they duck that question, because they find it impossible to choose among the 54 African countries, I think it's very difficult for the G4 to sort of unblock this. Another possibility, we floated this informally, is an interim solution, that one doesn't go straight for new permanent members, one goes for a sort of a stage of 20-year membership or 10-year membership, you know, so that you could have a stepping stone, as it were, to permanent membership, which might be more acceptable to the wider UN membership. And let's not forget that, you know, there's 175 or so, 8 countries that are not on the Security Council at the moment. You expand it to 25, you've still got 165 countries that are not members of the Security Council, and even fewer who are not permanent members. So there's a lot of concern among the wider membership that all you're doing is expanding the club of privileged countries at their expense.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Mark. I'm afraid we've run out of time. We could have gone on, I think, for quite a bit longer. I don't know about you, but the audience would certainly have happily gone on for longer, partly because I think the quality of your answers to the questions was, in my view, quite remarkable, and you've given us a tremendously in-depth overview of what is going on at the UN now, and for that we are enormously grateful. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.